Step out of the vehicle now!
You're coming with me.
Get out of the truck! Hands where I can see them, boy! The voice cut through the storm like a blade. Rain hammered the asphalt in sheets so thick the world beyond 10 feet dissolved into gray static. Lightning cracked the sky open, and in that brief flare of white, Marcus Thorne saw the man approaching his driver's side window. Massive shoulders, hand resting on his holster, face twisted into something between a sneer and a smile. Marcus raised both hands slowly, palms open toward the roof of the cab. His heart was already a war drum, not from fear of the gun or the badge, from the clock, the merciless, ticking clock that had been screaming in his skull for the past 90 minutes. "I said get out!" Kowalski's fist slammed against the window, hard enough to rattle the frame of the ancient Ford pickup. Marcus opened the door with shaking hands. The rain soaked him instantly, cold and punishing. He stepped down onto the roadside gravel, and before his second foot touched ground, Kowalski's hand was on his shoulder, spinning him around, slamming him chest first against the truck's rusted door. "You were doing 72 in a 55. Kowalski's breath was hot against Marcus's ear, reeking of coffee and contempt. "Where are you running to in such a hurry?" "I'm a doctor," Marcus said, voice tight. "There's a medical emergency. I need to—" "A doctor?" Kowalski laughed, a sound like gravel grinding. He yanked Marcus's arm behind his back, twisting the wrist upward until the shoulder socket screamed. "That what we calling it now? You look like you just crawled out of a ditch." Marcus's scrubs were gone. He'd been elbow-deep in floodwater and mud for 6 hours at a makeshift field clinic, then made the call to drive the organ himself when the helicopter couldn't fly. His father's old pickup was the only vehicle available. His shirt was streaked with dried blood from the extraction. His jeans were caked in red clay. He looked exactly like what Kowalski wanted to see. "Check my wallet," Marcus said through gritted teeth. "My credentials are—" Kowalski shoved him harder against the truck, and Marcus's cheek hit the cold metal. His vision sparked. The rain poured into his eyes, his mouth. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled like a funeral drum. "I'll check whatever I want to check," Kowalski said, "when I'm good and ready." Marcus's eyes slid to the passenger seat through the rain-blurred window. Sitting there, strapped in like a child, was the medical cooler. White, battered, plastered with red biohazard tape and a label printed in block letters. "Urgent, human organ." Inside that cooler, packed in sterile ice, was a 6-year-old girl's only chance at life. And the clock was still ticking. Marcus Thorne was 50 years old. His hair had gone silver at the temples 2 years ago, after his father died and left him nothing but this pickup truck and a lifetime of lessons about dignity under pressure. Tonight, those lessons felt like stones in his chest. The blood on his shirt wasn't his own. It belonged to a 19-year-old kid who'd been pinned under a collapsed trailer home in the flood zone outside Valdosta. Marcus had spent 40 minutes on his knees in rising water, performing a field amputation with a hacksaw and a prayer, because waiting for an ambulance meant watching the kid drown. The surgery had worked. The kid would live. Marcus had stripped off his surgical gown in the rain, climbed into his father's truck still wearing his blood-streaked undershirt, and made a choice. He was a cardiothoracic surgeon, one of 12 in the country who could perform a pediatric heart transplant on a patient under 20 pounds. His name appeared in medical journals. His hands had rebuilt hearts that other surgeons called hopeless. He'd served 2 tours in Afghanistan as a colonel in the Army Medical Corps, operating in tents while mortar fires shook the walls. He'd been awarded the Legion of Merit. He'd given a TED Talk on trauma surgery that had been viewed 4 million times. None of that mattered now. What mattered was the cooler. What mattered was the little girl whose name he didn't know, lying in a pediatric ICU 3 hours north, her heart failing in real time. What mattered was the donor family who had said yes in their worst moment so that another family might be spared. What mattered was the helicopter that couldn't fly, the ambulance that was stuck in flooding, and the surgeon who'd looked Marcus in the eye and said, "You're her only shot." Marcus had done the math in his head. Organ viability, 4 to 6 hours from harvest. Time elapsed, 2 hours and 18 minutes. Distance remaining, 143 miles. If he drove 70, maybe 75, he could make it. If he got pulled over, he'd explain, show his credentials. Any reasonable officer would understand. But Marcus had lived 50 years as a black man in America. He knew what reasonable meant when you were standing on the side of a highway in the dark. He'd press the accelerator anyway, because heroism wasn't a choice when a child was dying. It was just math. Cold, brutal, unforgiving math. And Marcus Thorne had never failed an equation in his life. Until tonight. Until the lights in his rearview mirror turned the rain into a kaleidoscope of red and blue, and he realized he'd bet a little girl's life on the premise that his skin wouldn't matter more than his credentials. He'd been wrong. The girl's name was Emma, 6 years old, brown curls, a laugh her mother said sounded like wind chimes. Born with hypoplastic left heart syndrome, a condition where half her heart simply never formed. She'd survived 3 surgeries before her 2nd birthday. The doctors had called her a miracle then. Now they called her ours. Her heart was giving out. The ventricular walls were collapsing. Her oxygen saturation levels were dropping every hour despite maximum intervention. Without a transplant, she would go into full cardiac arrest before dawn. The donor heart, a perfect match from a boy in Alabama who'd lost his fight with leukemia, had been harvested at 6:47 that evening. It was packed in preservation solution, submerged in ice, sealed in a sterile environment designed to keep tissue viable for exactly 6 hours. It was now 9:31. Marcus had calculated the margins down to the minute. If the heart arrived by 11:15, they could prep Emma and begin transplantation by midnight. If it arrived after 11:30, the organ would begin cellular degradation. After that, it wouldn't matter how skilled the surgeon was. You couldn't transplant death. The helicopter had been their first plan, a medical flight team, 10 minutes to the hospital. But the storm had rolled in with walls of wind that grounded every aircraft within 200 miles. The backup ambulance had tried to push through flooded county roads and gotten stuck axle deep in mud outside Tifton. That left Marcus and his father's pickup and a promise he'd made to Emma's mother in a quiet hospital corridor 3 hours ago. "I will not let your daughter die waiting." He wasn't a hero. He was a man with a cooler full of ice and a speedometer he couldn't afford to respect. Every minute he lost was a minute Emma didn't have. Every second he spent under the speed limit was a second closer to the moment her mother would hear the words no parent should ever hear. We did everything we could. Marcus had operated in war zones. He'd held hearts in his hands while blood pooled at his boots and explosions shook the ground. He'd made impossible decisions in fractions of seconds. But this driving, this waiting, this helplessness was worse than any battlefield. Because on a battlefield you could fight back. Here, on this highway, in this storm, all he could do was drive and pray and watch the clock bleed away Emma's future with every passing mile. The red and blue lights exploded in his mirrors like a grenade going off. Marcus felt his stomach drop. His hands tightened on the wheel. For one wild, desperate moment, he considered not stopping, just pushing the accelerator to the floor and letting the cop chase him all the way to the hospital, if that's what it took. But he knew better. He pulled over onto the shoulder, tires crunching on wet gravel, and watched the clock on the dashboard tick forward. 9:34. Emma had 2 hours and 41 minutes left. Sergeant Bert Kowalski was 6'4" and 260 pounds of muscle gone to fat. His neck was thicker than most men's thighs. His knuckles were scarred from years of what he called compliance assistance. In 3 counties, his nickname was whispered with equal parts fear and disgust. The hammer. He'd been investigated twice for excessive force. Both times the complaints had vanished into administrative limbo. He had friends, he had protection, and he had a particular talent for finding reasons to stop cars driven by people who didn't look like him. Tonight, drenched in rain and adrenaline, he looked at Marcus Thorne and saw exactly what he wanted to see. "Doctor," Kowalski said, drawing the word out like taffy, making it ridiculous. "You expect me to believe you're a doctor? Looking like that? Driving this piece of trash?" "I can show you my medical license," Marcus said carefully. "It's in my wallet. Left back pocket. I'm reaching for it now." "Don't you move." Kowalski's hands shifted on his holster. "I'll tell you when you can move." The rain hammered harder. Water ran in rivers down Marcus's face, into his eyes, soaking through his shirt until it clung to his skin like a second layer. His wrists ached where Kowalski had twisted them. His shoulder throbbed, but he kept his hands visible, kept his voice level, kept his face neutral. He'd learned this dance a long time ago. Survive first, argue later. "What's that smell?" Kowalski leaned in, sniffing theatrically. "You been smoking something? Meth? Crack? That why you're speeding?" "No, sir. I don't use drugs. I'm trying to get a transplant organ to—" "Transplant organ?" Kowalski laughed, a wet, ugly sound. "That's a new one. Usually they say it's medicine for their grandma or some garbage like that." He circled around Marcus, boots splashing through puddles, eyes scanning the truck's interior through the rain-streaked windows. "What you really got in there? Stolen goods? Guns? Fentanyl?" "I have nothing illegal," Marcus said. His jaw was clenched so tight it hurt. "Please, there's a child waiting for—" "A child?" Kowalski's tone shifted, mockery replaced by something sharper. Suspicion. "You got a kid in that truck?" "No, the organ is for a 6-year-old girl at—" "Open the door." Kowalski stepped back, hand now fully on his gun. "Open it, now." Marcus's heart hammered. The cooler on the passenger seat contains a human heart. It's in a sterile environment. If you open it without proper— "I said open the door." Kowalski's voice rose to a roar that cut through even the storm. "Or I'll open it myself and add resisting arrest to whatever else you're hiding." Thunder cracked overhead like the sky breaking in half. Lightning turned the world white for one frozen second. In that flash, Marcus saw Kowalski's face clearly. Jaw set, eyes hard, hand ready. This wasn't a traffic stop anymore. This was a man with power, looking at a man without it, and seeing an opportunity. "What's in the cooler?" Kowalski demanded, moving toward the passenger door. "Don't touch it," Marcus said, desperation finally cracking through his control. "Please, you'll contaminate—" Kowalski yanked the passenger door open. "Stop!" Marcus lunged forward, and Kowalski's other hand went to his gun, finger sliding to the trigger guard. "Back against the truck, now!" Marcus froze, hands up, palms out, rain streaming down his arms. "That container is sealed for a reason. The organ inside is in a sterile field. If you open it out here, if you expose it to contaminants, you'll destroy it. You'll kill—" "Shut your mouth." Kowalski reached into the truck and dragged the cooler out by its handle. It hit the gravel with a thud that made Marcus flinch. "I've heard every lie there is. Black guy, middle of the night, sealed cooler." He smiled. "I know exactly what this is." "It's labeled," Marcus said, voice breaking. "Read the label, please." Kowalski glanced at the biohazard tape, the red letters. His smile didn't waver. "Yeah, real official looking. You get that off Amazon? Think that's gonna fool me?" He knelt in the rain, one knee in a puddle, and popped the latches. "No." The lid came off. Steam rose from the ice inside, condensation meeting cold air. Kowalski peeled back the protective plastic sheeting with his bare hands. Hands that had touched his gun, his steering wheel, the contaminated door handle, and exposed the secondary container beneath. "Well, well," he said. What do we have here? The transplant bag sat nested in surgical ice, its contents barely visible through the translucent medical-grade plastic. Kowalski lifted it out, held it up to the light from his cruiser like he was inspecting a fish at the market. "This supposed to be a heart?" He laughed. "Looks like a piece of pork to me. You running some kind of black market butcher shop, boy?" Marcus felt something crack inside his chest. Not anger, worse. Despair so complete it felt like drowning. "Put it back," he whispered. "Please, put it back in the ice." Kowalski shook the bag, shook it, like it was a toy, like it was garbage. "You gonna tell me who you stole this from? Or do I gotta call in the dogs?" The rain poured over the organ bag, over Kowalski's filthy hands, over the open cooler sitting in a puddle on the side of a highway, where 18-wheelers threw up sprays of contaminated road water every time they passed. Marcus watched the seconds tick away in his mind, watched the sterile field collapse, watched bacteria and particulates and God knew what else settle onto the surface of the only thing standing between Emma and a closed casket. 6 hours of viability. That was the window. That was the promise. But viability assumed sterile transport, assumed controlled temperatures, assumed respect for the science that made miracles possible. This wasn't science anymore. This was murder by stupidity. Kowalski finally dropped the bag back into the cooler, but he didn't close the lid, didn't reseal the plastic, just left it sitting there, open to the storm, while he stood and wiped his hands on his pants. "You're under arrest for trafficking in illegal biologics and obstruction." Marcus didn't hear him. He was calculating, running the numbers. Contamination plus time plus distance equals what? 50% chance of rejection? 70? Would they even attempt the transplant now, or would they take one look at the compromised organ and tell Emma's mother there was nothing left to try? Somewhere, a little girl was running out of heartbeats, and Marcus couldn't do a damn thing to save her. Kowalski grabbed the cooler by the handle and carried it toward his cruiser like it was a case of beer. The lid flopped open with each step. Rain poured directly into the ice. The bag shifted, unprotected, bouncing against the plastic walls. "Careful with that," Marcus said, the words tasting like ash. "Please." Kowalski ignored him. He shoved the cooler into the trunk of the patrol car, slammed it shut, then turned back to Marcus with handcuffs already in his grip. "Hands behind your back." Marcus complied. He had no choice. The steel bit into his wrists, not snug but crushing, the way you'd restrain someone you wanted to hurt. Size 8 cuffs on size 10 wrists. Marcus felt the bones in his wrists grind together, felt the circulation cut off, felt his fingers start to tingle and then go numb. "Too tight," he managed. "They're supposed to be tight," Kowalski said. He yanked Marcus toward the cruiser, one hand fisted in the back of Marcus's shirt. "That's how you know they're working." Marcus stumbled, caught himself, let Kowalski shove him into the back seat of the patrol car. The door slammed shut. The sound was final, like a tomb ceiling. Steel mesh separated him from the front seat. No door handles in the back, no way out. Just a cage on wheels and the smell of sweat and vomit baked into the upholstery. "Wait," Marcus said through the mesh. "I need to make a call. One call. To the hospital. They need to know the organ is delayed. They need to prep alternative measures for the patient." Kowalski settled into the driver's seat, adjusting his rearview mirror to look back at Marcus. His eyes were cold and satisfied. "You got the right to remain silent," Kowalski said. "I suggest you use it. I'm not asking for a lawyer. I'm asking you to let me save a child's life. 30 seconds. One phone call. You can listen to every word." Kowalski reached down and clicked off his radio. The static died. The connection to dispatch, to backup, to any witness who might hear what happened next. Gone. "I don't think you understand your situation," Kowalski said slowly. "You're a criminal in my custody. You don't get to make demands. You don't get phone calls until I say so. And right now I'm thinking I need to inventory your vehicle real careful before we go anywhere. Might take an hour, maybe two. Marcus felt something collapse inside him. Not hope. He'd lost that when Kowalski opened the cooler. This was something deeper. The understanding that he was trapped in a nightmare with a man who enjoyed watching him suffer. Please, Marcus said, and hated the sound of his own voice begging. There's a 6-year-old girl who will die if that organ doesn't arrive in time. You can verify everything I've said. You can call the hospital. You can... What I can do, Kowalski interrupted, is my job, which is getting drug traffickers off the street. He smiled into the rearview mirror. Now sit tight. This might take a while. He got out of the car and walked back toward Marcus's truck, flashlight in hand, moving with the slow, deliberate pace of a man who had all the time in the world. Marcus sat in the cage, hands numb behind his back, watching the dashboard clock tick forward. 9:53. Emma had 1 hour and 22 minutes left. And Marcus, cardiac surgeon, former colonel, a man who'd saved hundreds of lives, couldn't do anything but watch the numbers fall. Marcus's father had installed the dash cam 3 years before he died. A cheap model from a truck stop, mounted on the windshield with a suction cup that never quite held steady. The old man had been rear-ended twice in 6 months and wanted proof next time someone lied about who hit who. Marcus had never thought to remove it. The camera had 2 features the box advertised in broken English: motion activate and cloud save when impact detect. Marcus had connected it to his phone's hotspot once, years ago, just to test it. He'd forgotten about it entirely after that. But the camera hadn't forgotten. When the patrol car's lights hit the truck and Marcus pulled over, a sudden deceleration the accelerometer registered as potential impact, the system woke up. It began recording. Front-facing lens capturing the highway, the storm, the approach of the officer. And because the phone in Marcus's pocket was still on, still broadcasting its weak signal through the rain, the footage began uploading in stuttering increments to a server farm in Oregon. Frame by frame, second by second. The conversation at the window, the hands on the shoulder, the face pressed against metal, the cooler being dragged from the truck, the lid opening, the bag lifted into rain and light, the shake, the careless drop, the smile. All of it captured in grainy, time-stamped proof. But Marcus didn't know. He sat in the back of the cruiser, wrists screaming, watching Kowalski tear through his truck with methodical cruelty. Glove compartment emptied onto the seat, registration checked and rechecked. Every pocket of the door panels searched. The officer was dragging out the inspection, making Marcus wait, making him suffer for the crime of driving, while black in a county where Kowalski made the rules. 10:14, 10:21, 10:35. The minutes fell away like blood from an open wound. Marcus closed his eyes and tried to pray, but the only words that came were calculations. Contamination rate, bacterial growth curves, the exact temperature at which cardiac tissue began irreversible necrosis. Numbers that added up to a little girl's funeral. He'd failed her. He'd promised Emma's mother he wouldn't let her daughter die waiting, and he'd failed. Finally, Kowalski returned to the cruiser, climbed in, and started the engine. No explanation, no update, just the lurch of the car pulling back onto the highway, heading in the wrong direction, away from the hospital toward the county jail 40 minutes south. Through the rear window, Marcus watched his father's pickup disappear into the rain, abandoned on the shoulder with its hazard lights blinking orange ghosts into the storm. Inside that truck, mounted to the windshield, a camera no one remembered continued recording, continued uploading, continuous building a case that would burn through lies like acid through paper. But technology is patient. It doesn't argue, doesn't plead, doesn't beg for mercy or basic human decency. It just watches and waits. At Children's Memorial Hospital, pediatric cardiothoracic surgeon Dr. Helena Voss checked her watch for the 37th time in the past hour. 11:02. Marcus Thorne should have arrived 47 minutes ago. She stood in the pre-op suite, gloved and ready, her surgical team assembled behind her like soldiers waiting for a battle that refused to begin. The operating theater was prepped, bypass machine calibrated, instruments sterilized and laid out in precise rows. Everything perfect, everything ready, except the heart. "Try his phone again," she said to the nurse beside her. "Still going to voicemail, doctor." Helena's jaw tightened. Marcus didn't miss calls. Not when a child's life was on the line. Something was wrong. In room 447, Emma's monitors sang their discordant song, heart rate climbing, blood pressure dropping, oxygen saturation at 82% despite maximum support. Her small body was shutting down, cell by cell, system by system. The ventricular walls were collapsing like wet paper. Her mother sat beside the bed, holding Emma's hand, whispering prayers that sounded more like negotiations with God. The ICU attending appeared in Helena's peripheral vision. His face said everything. "She's coding," he said quietly. "How long can you hold her?" "We're hitting her with everything we have. Maybe an hour, maybe less." Helena stripped off her gloves and walked to the nearest phone. She dialed the hospital director's private line. He answered on the first ring. "Where's the organ?" Director Emmett Carver demanded. "I don't know. Marcus Thorne left the extraction site 3 hours ago. He should have been here by now. He's not answering his phone. Something's happened." Silence on the line. Then, "The donor family?" "Alabama. I already called. The heart left their facility at 6:47. They confirmed Dr. Thorne took possession." So somewhere between there and here, a world-renowned surgeon and a human organ vanished into a storm. "That's what I'm telling you." She heard Carver take a breath, heard the creak of his chair as he stood. When he spoke again, his voice had shifted into something harder. "I'm making calls. Stay by the phone." The line went dead. Emmett Carver didn't waste time with hospital administrators or county sheriffs. He went straight to the top. His first call was to the governor's emergency line. It rang twice. "This is Carver at Children's Memorial. I need state police mobilization. We have a missing transplant surgeon, a missing organ, and a 6-year-old patient who will die in under an hour without intervention." The governor's chief of staff tried to redirect him. Carver cut him off. "The patient's mother is State Senator Jessica Hartwell. You want to explain to a sitting senator why we didn't use every resource to save her daughter's life?" 15 seconds of silence. Then, hold. The hold lasted less than a minute. When the line reconnected, it was the governor himself. "What do you need?" "Everything." 10 minutes later, phones began lighting up across 6 counties. State police, highway patrol, FBI field office, emergency dispatch centers. A bolo went out for Marcus Thorne, for his vehicle, for any officer who might have made a traffic stop matching the description. And in a county jail 40 miles south, a desk sergeant looked down at the intake log and saw a name that made his blood run cold. Dr. Marcus Thorne, arrested by Sergeant Kowalski, booked 11 minutes ago. The sergeant reached for his phone with shaking hands. 2 hours and 17 minutes after Marcus Thorne was thrown into a cell, the front door of the Hancock County Sheriff's Department exploded inward. Not literally, but close enough. Kowalski was at his desk, writing his report with the careful penmanship of a man constructing a lie. He'd done this before. You start with the truth. Suspect was speeding, appeared intoxicated, acted suspiciously, then you build the narrative around it. The cooler became evidence of illegal organ trafficking. The blood on the suspect's clothes became proof of violence. The refusal to comply became aggression. By the time Kowalski was done, the report would read like he'd saved the county from a dangerous criminal. He was on paragraph 3 when the lights from outside turned the bullpen blue and red. Multiple vehicles, heavy engines, the kind of presence that made small-town cops look up from their coffee and wonder what the hell was happening. Kowalski glanced toward the window. saw the black SUVs, saw the tactical van, saw men in body armor spilling out with the mechanical precision of a military operation. What the? The front door slammed open. No knock, no announcement, just federal authority walking in like they owned the place. Leading them was a U.S. Marshal, badge displayed on his chest, sidearm visible. Behind him came 4 more marshals, 2 FBI agents, and a woman in a tailored suit who moved like a missile with a target. The desk sergeant shot to his feet. "Can I help you?" "Department of Justice," the woman said, flashing credentials. "Special Agent Klein. We're here for a prisoner in your custody. Dr. Marcus Thorne. Where is he?" The sergeant's face went white. He's in holding. But you can't just..." "We can." Klein's voice could have cut steel. "This facility is now under federal oversight pending investigation into civil rights violations and obstruction of a medical emergency. Where is he?" Every cop in the room had frozen. Pens stopped moving. Conversations died mid-sentence. Even the drunk in the holding tank had gone silent. Kowalski stood slowly, his report still open on the desk in front of him. His hand moved instinctively toward his service weapon. 3 marshals had guns on him before his fingers touched leather. "Don't," the lead marshal said quietly. "Hands where I can see them. Now." Kowalski raised his hands, face flushing red. "I'm a law enforcement officer. I was doing my job. That man is a criminal." "That man," Klein interrupted, stepping forward until she was inches from Kowalski's face, "is Dr. Marcus Thorne, former Army colonel, world-renowned cardiac surgeon, and the only person standing between a 6-year-old girl and a coffin." Her voice dropped to something colder than the rain outside. "You stopped him. You arrested him. You contaminated a sterile transplant organ. And now that child is coding in an ICU because you decided a black man in an old truck couldn't possibly be telling the truth." Kowalski's mouth opened, closed. No words came out. "Which one of you," Klein said, raising her voice to address the entire room, "is Sergeant Bert Kowalski?" Kowalski's throat worked. "I am." Klein smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. "Good. Then you're under arrest." Behind her, the marshals moved forward with handcuffs ready. Behind the federal agents, another figure stepped through the doorway. She wore a charcoal suit despite the late hour. Her hair was pulled back in a tight bun. Her makeup was smudged at the corners of her eyes. The only evidence, she'd been crying. But her spine was steel, her jaw set, and when she walked into that police station, every person in the room felt the temperature drop. State Senator Jessica Hartwell didn't announce herself. She didn't need to. Kowalski recognized her from television, from campaign billboards, from the news segments where she'd pushed through healthcare reform and criminal justice legislation. He'd even voted against her once, back when he still pretended his ballot mattered more than his badge. She stopped 3 feet from Kowalski's desk and looked at him the way you'd look at something you scraped off your shoe. "My daughter," she said quietly, "is named Emma. She's 6 years old. She likes strawberry ice cream and fairy tales where the princess saves herself. She wants to be a veterinarian when she grows up." Her voice didn't waver, didn't break. It was the voice of a woman who'd already screamed herself hoarse in a hospital room and had nothing left but cold, calculated fury. 2 hours ago, she went into cardiac arrest. They brought her back. Barely. She's on full life support right now, and the only thing keeping her alive is a machine doing the work her heart can't do anymore. She took 1 step closer. Kowalski tried to step back and found a marshal's hand on his shoulder, holding him in place. "Dr. Marcus Thorne was bringing her a new heart," Jessica continued. "A donated heart from a little boy in Alabama whose parents made the hardest decision any parent can make. They said yes to saving my daughter. They said yes through their grief. And Dr. Thorne, a man who has saved more lives than you'll ever meet in your entire career, drove through a hurricane to deliver it." She paused, let the silence stretch. Let every cop in the room marinate in what was coming. And you stopped him. Kowalski's mouth was dry. I didn't know. You didn't ask. Her voice was a scalpel. You saw a black man in an old truck and you decided you knew everything you needed to know. She turned to Agent Klein. The organ, where is it? In the trunk of Sergeant Kowalski's patrol vehicle, Klein said. We've already retrieved it. Medical transport is en route. Jessica's eyes closed for just a moment. When they opened again, they locked onto Kowalski like a sniper's scope. Who touched it? She asked. Who opened the sterile container? Silence. I asked you a question, Sergeant. Who touched the organ? Kowalski's voice came out as a whisper. I did. With your bare hands? I thought it was... You thought... Jessica's laugh was hollow and terrible. You thought my daughter's only chance at life was drugs. You thought a decorated army surgeon was a criminal. You thought you had the right to destroy evidence without protocol, to contaminate medical equipment, to cost my child her life because your ignorance was more important than her heartbeat. She leaned forward, and Kowalski saw something in her eyes that made him understand exactly how much power he just made an enemy of. I'm going to make sure, Jessica Hartwell said softly, that you spend the rest of your life regretting the moment you decided my daughter wasn't worth believing in. Kowalski felt the handcuffs close around his wrists, and for the first time in his career, he understood what it felt like to be powerless. They found Marcus in cell 3, sitting on a concrete bench with his hands still cuffed behind his back. His wrists were raw and bleeding where the metal had cut through skin. His shirt was soaked through with rain and sweat, but his eyes were open, staring at the wall, calculating something only he could see. A marshal unlocked the cell. Dr. Thorne? Marcus looked up slowly, like a man waking from a nightmare into something worse. The organ, he said. Where is it? Being retrieved now. We have a medical helicopter standing by. Marcus was on his feet before the marshal finished speaking. Get these off me, now. The cuffs came off. Marcus brought his hands forward and saw the damage. Deep grooves in both wrists, blood crusting at the edges, nerve damage that would take weeks to heal. His fingers were stiff and swollen. He flexed them anyway, forcing circulation back, ignoring the pain. Agent Klein appeared with the cooler. She set it on the bench, carefully, like it was made of glass. Marcus dropped to his knees and opened it. The ice had melted into slush. The plastic sheeting was displaced. The secondary container had shifted during transport. He could see condensation where there shouldn't be condensation, warmth where there should be cold. He lifted the transplant bag with hands that had performed 3,000 surgeries and knew immediately, viscerally, that they were out of time. Temperature? He asked, voice clipped. Klein read from a portable thermometer one of the marshals had brought. 4.3 Celsius. Marcus closed his eyes, did the math. The organ had been outside optimal range for at least 90 minutes. Contamination was probable. Cellular degradation had already begun. In a perfect world, this heart would be discarded and they'd wait for another donor. But Emma didn't have another donor. She had this heart, compromised and dying, or she had nothing. Where's the helicopter? Marcus asked. Roof of the courthouse, 2 blocks. Marcus sealed the cooler, grabbed it by the handle, and ran. He didn't wait for an escort, didn't wait for permission. His legs burned, his lungs screamed, his wrists left a blood trail on the cooler's white handle, but he didn't slow down. Through the station, out the front door, into the rain that was still falling like the sky had declared war on the earth. 2 blocks became one became half. The courthouse rose ahead like a gray fortress, and Marcus took the stairs 3 at a time, bursting through the roof access door as the helicopter's rotors began their ascending whine. The pilot saw him coming and threw open the side door. Marcus dove in, cooler clutched to his chest, and before he'd even strapped in, the helicopter lurched upward. The ground fell away. The rain hammered the windscreen, Lightning cracked across the sky in jagged white scars, and Marcus sat in the vibrating metal belly of the aircraft, cradling a dying heart, and prayed that he still had time to prove that miracles weren't about perfection. They were about refusing to quit. The operating room was a cathedral of sterile light and controlled chaos. Marcus scrubbed in with hands that screamed protest at every movement, the raw wounds on his wrists splitting open again under the harsh antibacterial soap. He didn't care. Pain was irrelevant. Only precision mattered now. Dr. Helena Voss met his eyes across the prep sink. The heart? Compromised, contaminated, outside temp range for 93 minutes. Marcus's voice was steady despite everything. But it's what we have. Helena nodded once. No judgment, no hesitation, just the professional acknowledgement that they were about to attempt the impossible with suboptimal materials because the alternative was a child's funeral. Emma lay on the table, impossibly small beneath the surgical drapes. The bypass machine hummed its mechanical prayer, keeping her blood oxygenated while her own heart, what was left of it, struggled through its final beats. The anesthesiologist called out numbers: blood pressure, oxygen saturation, time, always time. Marcus made the first incision with hands that had forgotten they were injured. Muscle memory took over. Years of training, thousands of hours of practice, all compressed into movements so precise they looked choreographed. Open the chest, expose the heart, assess the damage. What he found was worse than the scans suggested. The ventricular walls were paper-thin, translucent, barely holding together. Another hour and Emma would have arrested beyond recovery. Bypass, Marcus said. The team moved like dancers, cannulas inserted, machine engaged. Emma's failing heart stopped beating, and the machine took over, pumping her blood in the rhythm her body could no longer maintain. Marcus lifted the dying heart from her chest, small enough to fit in his palm, malformed and exhausted, and set it aside. The cavity it left behind was a void waiting to be filled. He turned to the donor heart, examined it under the surgical lights, saw what he'd feared: minor tissue damage at the apex, slight discoloration where contamination had begun its work. Not catastrophic, not yet, but close. "We're debriding the compromised tissue," he said. "Scalpel." 40 miles away, in a police station that now crawled with federal investigators, Sergeant Kowalski sat in an interrogation room, watching his career die in real time. The dashcam footage played on a laptop in front of him, crystal clear despite the rain, time-stamped, geotagged, uploaded to a server that preserved it beyond any possibility of deletion or tampering. There he was, yanking Marcus from the truck. There he was, opening the cooler. There he was, shaking the transplant bag like it was a toy, while Marcus begged him to stop. Agent Klein sat across the table, expressionless. "You want to explain this?" Kowalski stared at the screen, watched himself destroy evidence, watched himself commit what would be classified as reckless endangerment of a minor, watched his freedom evaporate frame by frame. "You thought wrong," Klein said, "and now a federal grand jury is going to decide whether your thoughts constitute criminal negligence or something worse." In the operating room, Marcus worked with the focused intensity of a man who had run out of time but refused to accept it. Sutures placed with micron precision, vessels connected, electrical pathways tested. Helena monitored the donor heart's rhythm. Perfusion stable, no rejection markers yet. Yet. Marcus didn't respond. He was already moving to the next connection, the next vessel, the next impossible stitch that might buy Emma a future. The surgery stretched on. Minutes became an hour became 2, and in the observation gallery above, Senator Jessica Hartwell stood with her hands pressed against the glass, watching strangers fight for her daughter's life with tools and skill and desperate, furious hope. The courtroom was federal, which meant Kowalski couldn't rely on the local boys' club to save him. No friendly judges. No sympathetic prosecutors who'd golf with the police chief on weekends. Just the cold machinery of justice operating exactly as designed. The charges were read by a prosecutor who spoke like she was listing ingredients, not crimes. Deprivation of rights under color of law. Reckless endangerment of a minor. Obstruction of medical emergency services. Destruction of medical evidence. Each count carried years. Together they carried decades. Kowalski's lawyer, a public defender who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, tried the only defense available: qualified immunity. The argument that police officers, acting in good faith during the course of their duties, cannot be held personally liable for mistakes made in the line of work. The judge, a woman in her 60s who'd spent 30 years on the bench, listened without expression. Then she asked one question. Was opening a clearly labeled medical container and handling its contents with bare hands in a rainstorm an action consistent with law enforcement training? The lawyer hesitated. Your Honor, my client believed. I asked about training, not belief. Silence. Qualified immunity, the judge said, protects officers who make reasonable mistakes under difficult circumstances. It does not protect malicious, reckless, or grossly negligent behavior that any reasonable person would recognize as harmful. She looked directly at Kowalski. Your immunity is denied. This case will proceed to trial. The trial lasted 3 days. The prosecution's evidence was devastating in its simplicity. They played the dashcam footage, all of it, 8 minutes and 42 seconds of Kowalski pulling Marcus from the truck, ignoring his explanations, mocking his profession, opening the medical cooler, and contaminating a human organ while the donor surgeon begged him to stop. The jury, 7 women, 5 men, racially diverse, economically mixed, watched in silence. One woman covered her mouth. A man in the back row wiped his eyes. By the time the video ended, the verdict was already written on their faces. Expert witnesses testified about organ viability, contamination protocols, and the precise sequence of failures that nearly killed Emma Hartwell. A pediatric cardiologist explained in painful detail what happens to a 6-year-old's body when her heart stops working and no replacement is available. Senator Hartwell took the stand. She didn't cry. She didn't rage. She simply described sitting in a hospital room, holding her daughter's hand, watching the monitors flatline, while somewhere on a highway, a police officer decided his assumptions were more important than her child's life. The defense had nothing, no credible witnesses, no alternative narrative that made sense. Just Kowalski's insistence that he was doing his job, that he couldn't have known, that it wasn't his fault. The jury deliberated for 90 minutes, guilty on all counts. The sentencing hearing was brief. The federal guidelines were clear. The judge showed no mercy because the crime showed no humanity. 15 years in federal prison, she said, to be served without possibility of parole. Kowalski stood as the bailiffs approached. This time, when they put the handcuffs on, standard issue, properly sized, closed with professional indifference. He didn't resist, didn't argue, didn't smile. He just stared straight ahead as they led him away, finally understanding what it felt like to be judged by the content of your actions instead of the color of your skin. The courtroom door closed behind him with a sound like a tomb ceiling, and he was gone. The investigation didn't stop with Kowalski. Federal investigators had learned long ago that corruption rarely existed in isolation. Where you found one dirty cop, you usually found a network. They found the network in Hancock County within 72 hours. It started with Kowalski's phone records, text messages to other officers using coded language that wasn't quite coded enough, references to packages and pickups and Tuesday distributions that had nothing to do with legitimate police work. Then came the financial records. Kowalski's bank account showed deposits that didn't match his salary, small amounts, carefully staggered, but consistent. $2,000 here, $1,500 there, Always cash, always untraceable. Until the FBI started watching who else made similar deposits on similar schedules. 6 officers, including the police chief. The pattern emerged like a photograph developing in chemicals. Traffic stops targeting specific demographics. Seizures of property under civil forfeiture laws. Medical supplies, prescription medications, and equipment confiscated as evidence that never made it to the evidence locker. They called themselves the Tuesday Club, an inside joke. Every Tuesday night they met at a storage unit outside town and divided the profits from their illegal enterprise, selling confiscated medications to black market dealers, auctioning medical equipment to unscrupulous clinics, pocketing cash seized from people too afraid or too poor to fight back. The storage unit, when the FBI raided it, contained enough evidence to fill 3 cargo vans, insulin pens stolen from diabetics, EpiPens taken from families with allergic children, inhalers, blood pressure medications, heart monitors, oxygen concentrators, all of it logged in a handwritten ledger that detailed dates, sources, and selling prices. One entry dated 8 months prior read, "Wheelchair from traffic stop, sold $400. Another, insulin 6 vials, J. Martinez seizure, sold $800. The FBI cross-referenced the names, found the victims, interviewed them. An elderly woman who'd been stopped for a broken taillight and had her diabetes medication confiscated because Kowalski claimed the prescription looked suspicious. She'd spent 3 days in diabetic crisis before her doctor could get her new supplies. A veteran with PTSD whose anti-anxiety medication was seized during a wellness check. He'd attempted suicide 2 weeks later. A mother whose son's asthma inhaler was taken at a checkpoint. The boy ended up in the ER that same night. None of them had filed complaints. They'd been too scared, too convinced that the system wouldn't believe them over a badge. The Department of Justice didn't ask permission. They walked into Hancock County Sheriff's Department at 6 a.m. on a Thursday with federal warrants and forensic accountants. By noon, the entire command structure was under arrest. By evening, the DOJ announced federal receivership. The local department was being dissolved and rebuilt from scratch under federal oversight. The press conference was brief. Agent Klein stood at a podium and explained in clinical terms what the officers had done. Systematic abuse of power, targeted exploitation of vulnerable populations, and a conspiracy to profit from human suffering. She didn't use the word evil. She didn't need to. The evidence spoke for itself. Behind her, projected on a screen, was a photograph of the storage unit's interior. Boxes stacked floor to ceiling, each one filled with medication that could have saved lives, equipment that could have prevented suffering, supplies that had been stolen from people who'd committed no crime except being powerless in the presence of power. The system hadn't just failed, it had been weaponized, and now, finally, it was collapsing under the weight of its own corruption. Emma Hartwell opened her eyes 6 days after the transplant. The ICU was dim, machines humming their steady rhythms around her bed. Her mother was asleep in the chair beside her, hands still holding Emma's, even in unconsciousness. The girl looked at the ceiling for a long moment, then at the tubes and wires connecting her to various monitors, then at her mother's tear-stained face. "Mommy?" she whispered. Jessica jerked awake, saw her daughter's eyes open, saw her breathing on her own, saw life where there had almost been only absence. She didn't scream for nurses, didn't cry out in joy. She just leaned forward and pressed her forehead against Emma's small hand and wept, silent, shaking tears of relief so profound they had no sound. The medical team came later, ran tests, checked vitals, monitored the new heart's rhythm and function. Everything looked good, better than good. The organ had taken, the body wasn't rejecting it. Emma's color was returning, her strength was building. Dr. Voss reviewed the charts with cautious optimism. She'll need immunosuppressants for life, regular monitoring, but she's going to make it. No one cheered. No one celebrated. They just nodded and went back to work because miracles in hospitals looked a lot like exhausted professionals doing their jobs against impossible odds. Marcus Thorne wasn't there for Emma's awakening. He'd left the hospital 3 days after the surgery, once it was clear she'd stabilized. He didn't attend the press conferences, didn't give interviews, didn't accept Senator Hartwell's invitation to a formal thank you ceremony. He just went home. His apartment was small and quiet, medical journals stacked on every surface, a coffee maker that got more use than the stove, photographs of his father on the mantel, the old man standing beside the same pickup truck that had carried a child's salvation through a storm. Marcus sat at his kitchen table and looked at his hands. The wounds from the handcuffs had scabbed over but would scar. Deep grooves in both wrists where the metal had cut through skin and into tissue. His left hand had nerve damage, 2 fingers that wouldn't quite flex all the way, a tremor that hadn't been there before. He'd spent 25 years building those hands into instruments of precision, training them, trusting them, using them to repair what seemed irreparable. And in one night, on the side of a highway, a man who saw only skin color had tried to destroy them. Marcus flexed his fingers slowly, felt the stiffness, the pain, the limitation that might never fully heal. He'd still operate. The damage wasn't career-ending, but it was permanent. A reminder, written in scar tissue, of what hatred cost. Not just the victims, everyone. Emma would live. That was what mattered. That was the equation that balanced. One child's heartbeat against one surgeon's scars. But sitting alone in his kitchen, looking at hands that had saved thousands of lives and might never work quite the same again, Marcus understood something he'd always known, but never felt so deeply. Justice wasn't the same as healing, and some wounds left marks that courtrooms couldn't erase. The final hearing was a formality. Kowalski's appeals had been exhausted. The sentence was final. But federal law allowed victims to address the court before imprisonment began. Marcus hadn't planned to attend. He'd said everything he needed to say through his actions. The surgery, the survival, the scars on his wrists. But Senator Hartwell had called him personally and asked him to come. Not for Kowalski, for everyone else who needed to hear what prejudice actually cost. So he came. The courtroom was packed. Press in the back rows, federal observers, representatives from civil rights organizations, and Kowalski sitting at the defense table in an orange jumpsuit, wrists and ankles shackled, looking smaller than Marcus remembered. The judge asked if Dr. Thorne wished to make a statement. Marcus stood, walked to the podium. His hands rested on the wooden surface, and in the fluorescent light, the scars on his wrists were clearly visible to everyone watching. He looked at Kowalski for a long moment. Then he spoke. "You saw the color of my skin and decided I was a criminal. You saw an old truck and decided I was worthless. You saw blood on my clothes and assumed violence instead of service." His voice was quiet but carried to every corner of the room. You didn't ask questions. You didn't check credentials. You didn't consider for even 1 second that the man standing in front of you might be telling the truth. Kowalski stared at the table, said nothing. "I've spent 25 years as a surgeon," Marcus continued. "I've held hundreds of hearts in these hands. Hearts from Black patients, white patients, Asian, Hispanic, indigenous, rich and poor, young and old." He held up his scarred hands so the courtroom could see them clearly. "And I can tell you something with absolute certainty. When you cut through the chest and hold a human heart in your hands, it doesn't have a color. It's not black, it's not white, it's just red, just muscle and blood, and the rhythm that keeps us all alive." He lowered his hands. "You looked at me and saw a threat. But when that little girl was lying on an operating table dying, her heart didn't care what color the surgeon was who saved her. It just needed someone skilled enough and compassionate enough to give her a future." Marcus's voice hardened. "Your ignorance almost murdered a 6-year-old child. Your prejudice almost made a mother bury her daughter. Your hatred nearly turned a donor family sacrifice into a meaningless tragedy. He leaned forward slightly. You saw what you wanted to see, and you almost killed someone because of it. The courtroom was utterly silent. Prejudice isn't just words, Marcus said. It's not just discomfort or preference. It's a weapon, and you used it. The difference between what you saw and what was real is measured in a child's heartbeat. The color of blood is red. The color of ignorance is the stain you'll wear for the rest of your life. He stepped back from the podium. The judge nodded. Mr. Kowalski, you have anything to say? Kowalski shook his head. Then this court is adjourned. They led Kowalski away. Marcus watched him go. A man who judged by skin and would now be judged by bars. A man who'd wielded power without wisdom and would spend 15 years learning the cost. The courtroom emptied. Marcus walked out into sunlight that felt warmer than it should. Somewhere in that same city, Emma Hartwell was learning to ride a bike again, with a new heart beating strong in her chest. And the world kept turning. The lesson remains: what you do in darkness will be brought to light. Who you choose to see in others reflects who you truly are. And the assumptions you make in ignorance can cost someone everything, including a life you'll never get the chance to save. If you witness injustice, document it. If you have power, question your assumptions. If you see someone in need, believe them first and investigate second. Because the person you dismiss might be the only one who can save a life. And prejudice doesn't just harm its victims. It destroys everyone it touches, one decision at a time.